Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. Today I'm going to be laying out roof trusses for my shed project. I'm sharing this video for reference or entertainment purposes only. I'm not a carpenter or an expert in building by any stretch of the imagination, so keep that in mind when you watch through this series. There may be some things here that you'll find helpful, or maybe you'll see some mistakes I'm making along the way. Either way, what I show here isn't necessarily what you should do if you were building a shed. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, let's get on with the project. So before getting started with building any of the roof trusses, what I first needed to do was figure out the basic design that I wanted to use. So the first thing that I decided is that I wanted to have roof trusses with a stringer at the bottom. So that's partly for strength of the roof, but also so that I can store things on top of them once the shed is done. So the next thing that I needed to determine was what I wanted for a pitch of my roof. So I figured what I'd do is match the pitch of the roof of my house. So the first thing I did is went and measured it and found that it was a 6/12 pitch, meaning that for every 12 inches of horizontal distance, the roof rises 6 inches. So I came over here and laid out a 6/12 pitch for the shed, but it just seemed a little bit too shallow and wasn't going to give me very much storage room up above the ceiling of the shed. So then I decided to take a look at a 7/12 pitch, and that seemed to fit a little bit better. So that's what I'm going to go with. Another reason I like the 7/12 roof pitch is because when I kind of figured out material utilization, it's going to be fairly efficient. And we'll talk more about that later in the project. And the last reason I like the 7/12 roof pitch is because when you work out all the angles, it ends up being 30 degrees and 60 degrees, which are nice round numbers that a novice like me can work with and easily understand. So the first thing that I want to do is cut all of my 12-foot stringers down to actually 12 feet. When I measure out these boards, they're all roughly 12 feet, 5/8 inches long. So I want to cut that extra 5/8 inches off. So instead of measuring out each of the rest of my stringers with the tape measure, what I've done is taken the first one that I've cut and labeled it as my master. And I'll use that one to mark out and measure off the rest of them. So as you can see here, I've got the master on top of the next stringer that I want to cut. I'll use that to draw my line and then cut it to length. So I've got all my 12-foot stringers cut to length. What I want to do now is set up sort of one roof truss as sort of a template or a master, just to make sure that everything is going to lay out the way that I want. So what I'm going to do is grab two of my 8-foot 2x4s to form one set of rafters. So I'm going to cut the 30-degree angle in each of the boards so that I can form the peak of the truss. I've got one of my 8-foot 2x4s on the driveway here ready to go. So I'm going to grab my speed square and I'm going to line up the corner of it to the corner of my board. Now I'm not sure if it's showing up in the camera, but there is a mark here on mine that says pivot. So now that I have that lined up, I'm going to pivot the speed square, keeping the corner lined up to the corner of the board until I get the 30-degree mark that's on this edge of the speed square lined up to this edge of the board. So I'm not sure if it's showing up in the camera, but the 30-degree mark is here. And then over here on this edge of the speed square, there's also a 7, which correlates to the 7/12 pitch that I'm going for. Now that I've got the speed square lined up the way that I want, I've got my angle established, and I'm going to mark that with my pencil. So now I'm over at the miter saw and I'm going to set it to the 30-degree angle that I need. Once I get it positioned, I'm going to lock the handle down so nothing can move. So now I can just line up my mark to the saw blade and cut this. So just like I did with my stringers, I'm going to use this first rafter that I've cut as sort of a master. I'm going to line it up to an uncut rafter on the bottom, and I'm going to mark the same angle that I just cut. So I need to cut 60-degree angles in the ends of my 12-foot stringers, but I don't want them right at the corner of the board. I want to actually have about a 1/2 inch of flat or straight before the angle starts. And I'll explain why a little later in the video. But right now I'm going to lay it out. So I'm going to use my tape measure and I'm going to mark off a 1/2 inch from one edge. And then I'll grab my square and mark off a line. And then I'll also mark it on the top and bottom of the board. Now I'll do the same thing on the other end of the board. Now, like I said, I'm not an expert in carpentry, and a real carpenter might know a better way to do this, but there's a couple ways to lay this angle out. The first would be to use the speed square, but it might not be exactly accurate because the lip of the speed square is going to interfere with the edge of the board since I'm not setting this angle right at the corner. So what I think I'm going to do instead is use this angle finder and a protractor to set my 60-degree angle. So what I've done is taken my protractor and put it on the lip of the angle finder, and then I've slid it over, hopefully you guys can see that, so that the metal part of the angle finder is lined up with the 30-degree mark on the protractor. And then I tightened up this wing nut to lock it in place. So now what I'm going to do is square up the plastic edge of my angle finder to the edge of the board, and then I'm going to slide it over until the metal edge intersects the end of the line off the edge of the board here. And now I can scribe my angle. So I want to mark this on both sides of the board, so I'm actually going to flip it over and then repeat the process on the back. So now I'll mark the other end of the board. So what I'm about to show next is a little bit unorthodox, but my miter saw won't cut a 60-degree angle. So what I've done is I've set up my stringer perpendicular to the saw so that I can use the 30-degree setting to make my 60-degree cut. Let's take a closer look. I've got my speed square set up and clamped to the fence of the saw so that I can make sure that the board is perpendicular to the blade when it's at 90 degrees. I've got the saw still set to the 30-degree angle that I used to cut the rafters in the last step. So then I positioned the speed square so that I could butt the board up to it, and then when I make my cut, the blade is in the right position to follow the line that I marked on the edge of the board and leave that ½ inch on the end of my stringer. And of course, before I cut anything, I made sure that when I bring the blade down, it's lined up where I want it to be. So the one thing that I need to be careful of is, without putting some kind of auxiliary fence back here, as I cut the board, if I push this way on it, it's going to want to tend to make the board go that way and skew the angle of the cut. So as I hold the board, I want to make sure that I hold it straight down against the table of the saw. So now I can spin the board around and then flip it over to make the cut on the other side. I'm going to lay everything out on the shed base here to make sure that I've got everything set up correctly. So I've got my 12-foot stringer lined up to the edge of the shed, and I've got the two ends squared up to the front and back. What I'm going to do now is measure out and find the exact center of the stringer, which should be 6 feet. So now I've grabbed my rafters and I'm going to get them roughly positioned on the base of the shed here. Now I'm going to grab this 4-foot long drywall square that I have and line it up to the center line that I made on the stringer. And now what I'll do is slide the rafters into position so that the line where they butt up against each other is right in line with the edge of the square. So I've got the peak of the rafters butted right up against each other, lined up to my square, and everything looks good. I'm just going to double check the ends and make sure that they're flush to the stringer. So next up, I'm going to figure out my plumb cut. So I want an 8-inch overhang. So since my fascia board will probably be a 1-inch thick board, I'm actually only going to measure over 7. So that once the fascia board is in place, I have my full 8-inch overhang that I'm looking for. So I'm going to measure off from the end of my stringer 7 inches. So now I'm going to grab my speed square and I'm going to line up the 30-degree mark with the edge of the board. And then I'm going to slide this over until I find my 7-inch line. Now I'll just double check my measurement and make sure I'm good. Now I'll repeat the process on the other side. So I've got the plumb cuts done. I brought the rafters back in and lined them up just to make sure everything was right, and it looks good to me. So what I'm going to do now is make a template right on the shed base so that when I lay out the next set of rafters, I don't need to line everything up. I can just throw them in and make sure that they're good. I've grabbed the piece of plywood and I'm going to lay out the gussets that I'm going to use to assemble my truss pieces. So I have a basic CAD system available to me that I was able to use to kind of sketch up a pattern to fit my piece of plywood. And of course on the CAD system I can just measure everything out and then lay it out on my 2x4 the same way it is in the CAD. But just to double check everything, I'm going to use my square to kind of lay everything out. So first I'm going to create the gusset plates for the peak of the trusses. And I've decided I want that gusset plate 8 inches wide. So I've laid out already an 8-inch wide strip on my piece of plywood. Now what I'm going to do now is lay out the angles that I need to cut for the gusset plates. So I already know my roof pitch is 12/7. So I can lay out my framing square so the 12-inch mark is right at the corner of my piece of plywood. and then I can swing it over so that the 7-inch mark on the other end of the square is at the edge. So now I can trace out the line, but as you may be able to see, it doesn't quite reach the top. So all I have to do is just slide this over, align the edge of the square to my line, make sure that it's trued up, and then finish the line. So now I can line up my square so that the corner of it lines up to where the angled line meets my straight 8-inch horizontal line. And then I'll just make a small mark here at the bottom of the plywood. Now I'll measure the distance from the edge of the plywood, and I get 13 3/4 inches. So now if I set my tape measure so it's on my center line, and I go over 13 3/4 inches, I'll make a mark. So now I'll grab my square and I'll line up my 7-inch mark to the mark that I just made. And then I'll pivot it around and line up the 12-inch mark to the edge of the piece of plywood. And now that should be the angle of the opposite side of my triangle. And again, it doesn't quite reach, so I'll slide my square up, line everything up, and if I've done everything correctly, they should meet in the middle. And hopefully you should be able to see that they do. So now I'll just repeat this process down the length of the board and finish tracing out those triangles. So now that I have the peaks laid out, I'm going to lay out the gussets for the ends of the trusses. And for that, I'm just going to go based on the measurements that I drew from my CAD system. Basically, I wanted each patch 12 inches wide, so that's what I'm going to start with. So I'm going to start right above my top plates, and I'm going to measure over 12 inches. Then I'm going to grab my square, I'm going to line it up to my 8-inch line, and then I'm going to mark off and measure 11.5 inches. And then I'm going to slide over to my 12-inch mark, make sure that my square is squared up to my 8-inch horizontal line, and then I'm going to mark off 4.5 inches. So I accidentally drew an extra line here, so ignore that for now. But I'm going to line up my square from my 11.5 inch mark to my 4.5 inch mark, and I will draw a line there. And then I'll come back here and draw a vertical line on this measurement. So now I'm going to repeat this pattern all the way down the board. I've got everything laid out on my piece of plywood, and I've got it set up here ready to cut. Now this would be easier if I had a set of sawhorses, but I don't. So I'm using this old junk workmate table. I've got my board screwed to it so it won't move. I'll start making some of the bigger cuts and then get to the smaller ones. So I cut one more set of rafters using my master rafters that are over there as my measuring guides. Now what I'm going to do is assemble one truss just to make sure everything goes together okay before I cut the rest of my wood. Ow, really? So I think that looks pretty good. I'll put a set of gusset plates on the other side of this just to finish it off. And then I'll cut the rest of my rafters and stringers. So I've just gotten finished building all 11 of my trusses. You can see I've got 5 of them behind me and 6 of them are already done and stored away in my cellar so they don't get wet. One thing I forgot to mention earlier in the video is that I made 2 of the end trusses with gussets only on one side. You can see one of those leaning up right there. It's only got gussets on sort of the back of it as we're looking at it. And the reason for that is that those 2 trusses are going to be on the ends of the shed, so there's going to be plywood or sheathing kind of going up the wall and the gusset would be in the way. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see any of the other videos in my shed building series or want to support my channel, check the links in the description below. Thanks for watching.